She stood in the corner of the grand ballroom, wrapped in a simple beige coat, as her husband's mistress paraded past with a triumphant smirk. Chloe thought she had won the ultimate prize, the handsome vice president, and a one-way ticket to corporate royalty. What Chloe didn't know, and what Arthur had completely missed, was that the very floor they danced on, and the entire corporation, legally belonged to the quiet woman they were laughing at. The morning of the annual Harrington and Cole corporate gala began much like any other in the Pendleton household, with Arthur Pendleton adjusting his silk tie in the mirror, his gaze entirely focused on his own reflection. Evelyn Hayes, his wife of 5 years, sat on the edge of their modest bed, quietly sipping her black coffee. She watched him practice his power smile, a practiced stretching of the lips that didn't reach his cold, ambitious eyes. "Evelyn, please tell me you're not wearing that dreadful brown dress tonight," Arthur said, not bothering to turn around. He smoothed the lapels of his custom Italian suit. "The regional directors are going to be there. The new parent company, Meridian Global, just finalized the buyout of our firm last week. The rumors are swirling that they are sending representatives to the gala to evaluate the executive team. I need to look flawless. I need us to look flawless. Or at the very least, I need you to not look like a substitute teacher." Evelyn looked down at her hands, her expression unreadable. "I have a navy blue dress, Arthur. It's perfectly fine." "Fine isn't going to cut it," he scoffed, finally turning to face her. His eyes swept over her with a mixture of pity and barely concealed disdain. "Look, just try to blend in. Don't talk about your little gardening club, and for God's sake, don't mention that you clip coupons. I am on the verge of being named Chief Executive Officer of this branch. The new owners are looking for dynamic, modern leadership. They want sharks, Evelyn. Not whatever it is you do all day. I maintain our home, Arthur, and I manage investments." Evelyn replied, her voice soft, dangerously calm. "Right, your little savings bonds." Arthur chuckled condescendingly, grabbing his leather briefcase. "Just don't embarrass me tonight. Chloe will be there, and she's handling the event's PR. You could learn a thing or two from her about presenting yourself." Chloe Montgomery. The name alone hung in the air like a toxic vapor. Chloe was Harrington, and Cole's newly appointed Director of Public Relations. She was 28, fiercely ambitious, and possessed a wardrobe that cost more than Arthur's annual salary, a fact that would have puzzled anyone who didn't know where she was getting her extra income. But Evelyn knew. Evelyn knew everything. What Arthur didn't know was that the savings bonds Evelyn managed were actually a massive, multi-billion-dollar trust left to her by her late grandfather, a fiercely private industrialist who taught Evelyn the value of anonymity. When Evelyn and Arthur met, she had introduced herself as a simple administrative assistant. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for the zeros in her bank account. For the first few years, Arthur had been kind, if a bit overly ambitious, but as he climbed the corporate ladder, his ego inflated, and his affection for his quiet, unassuming wife turned into contempt. The ultimate betrayal had begun 6 months ago. Evelyn had hired a private investigator after noticing a recurring charge on their joint credit card for a luxury boutique hotel downtown. The photos the investigator brought back were crystal clear: Arthur and Chloe Montgomery, laughing, kissing, and walking arm in arm into the lobby. Instead of crying, Evelyn had made a phone call. She called Richard Gable, the acting CEO, and her trusted proxy at Meridian Global, the massive private equity firm she entirely owned. "Richard," she had said, looking at the glossy photos of her husband's infidelity, "I want you to initiate a hostile takeover of Harrington and Cole. Buy the entire firm, but keep my name entirely out of it." For 6 months, Evelyn had watched the acquisition unfold behind the scenes. She had watched Arthur stress over the buyout, then grow increasingly arrogant as he believed his stellar, though fabricated sales reports would secure him the CEO position under the new regime. She had read the forensic accounting audits that Richard forwarded to her private server, detailing how Arthur and Chloe had been skimming funds from the marketing budget to fund their weekend getaways to Aspen and Paris. They were stealing from Harrington and Cole, which meant effectively they were stealing from her. As Arthur slammed the front door behind him, leaving for the office, Evelyn stood up and walked to the closet. She pushed aside the plain, unassuming blouses she wore to keep up her charade. Hidden in the back, locked in a biometric safe, were the garments of her true life. Tailored bespoke suits from Savile Row diamond earrings that belonged in a museum, and the legal documents proving she was the sole proprietor of Meridian Global. Tonight she would wear the unassuming navy blue dress. She would let Arthur and Chloe play their final hand. She would let them revel in their illusion of superiority. Because tomorrow, the illusion would shatter. The ballroom at the Grand Seattle Plaza Hotel was dripping in crystal chandeliers and the intoxicating scent of expensive perfumes and imported lilies. A string quartet played softly in the corner, drowned out by the clinking of champagne flutes and the loud, boastful laughter of corporate climbers. Evelyn arrived 30 minutes after Arthur. He had insisted they take separate cars because he needed to network before she arrived to distract him. She stepped into the ballroom wearing her vintage navy blue dress. It was completely unbranded, featuring no flashy logos or revealing cuts. To the untrained eye, it looked like an off-the-rack department store purchase. In reality, it was a custom-fitted piece from a private atelier in Milan, constructed from silk, woven so finely it felt like water. She spotted Arthur almost immediately. He was holding court near the ice sculpture, a glass of scotch in one hand, gesturing expansively with the other to a group of regional directors. Standing intimately close to his side was Chloe Montgomery. Chloe was a vision in a skin-tight emerald green gown that left very little to the imagination. A heavy diamond pendant rested on her chest, a pendant Evelyn immediately recognized from a receipt she had intercepted 3 weeks prior. It had cost $25,000. Arthur had told Evelyn he couldn't afford to fix the leaky roof in their kitchen that month. Evelyn glided silently toward the bar, ordering a sparkling water. She turned just in time to see Chloe whisper something in Arthur's ear. Arthur laughed, his eyes darting across the room until they landed on Evelyn. His smile instantly vanished, replaced by a deep scowl of annoyance. He muttered something to Chloe, detached himself from the group and marched over to his wife. "You're late," Arthur hissed, grabbing Evelyn's elbow entirely too hard. "Traffic on the I-5 was backed up," Evelyn replied, evenly, gently, but firmly, pulling her arm from his grasp. "You seem to be having a good time." "I am working, Evelyn. Networking. Securing our future," Arthur snapped. He looked her up and down. "I thought I told you to wear something that stands out. You look like you're attending a funeral." "Maybe I am," Evelyn said softly. Arthur furrowed his brows. What is that supposed to mean? Before she could answer, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of stilettos approached. Chloe Montgomery materialized beside Arthur, her lips curled into a predatory smirk. She looked Evelyn up and down, her eyes full of malicious amusement. "Evelyn, you made it," Chloe chimed, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Arthur was just telling us he wasn't sure if you'd be able to find a babysitter for your... Oh wait, you don't have children, do you? What is it you do with your time again? I keep busy?" Evelyn smiled politely, her eyes locking onto the diamond pendant resting against Chloe's skin. "That's a beautiful necklace, Chloe. The cut of the diamond is exquisite. It looks brand new." Chloe's hand fluttered to the gem, a flush of triumph coloring her cheeks. She shot a quick conspiratorial glance at Arthur. "Oh, this... It was a gift. From someone very special who appreciates my hard work at the office." "I'm sure you work very hard, Chloe," Evelyn said, her voice completely devoid of sarcasm, which somehow made it sound even more piercing. "It's amazing how much effort PR requires these days, especially the off-site meetings." Arthur cleared his throat loudly, visibly uncomfortable. "Chloe has been instrumental in keeping the firm's image spotless during the Meridian Global acquisition. In fact, when I'm named CEO tomorrow by the new board, I plan on promoting Chloe to Vice President of Communications." "Is that so?" Evelyn took a slow sip of her sparkling water. "And you're certain Meridian Global will appoint you?" "I'm the only logical choice." Arthur puffed his chest out. "I brought in the highest margins this quarter. The Meridian representatives are here tonight, moving incognito. I've already spoken to 3 men I suspect are their scouts. They were highly impressed with my vision." "Arthur is a visionary," Chloe purred, stepping closer to him, subtly brushing her hip against his. "He understands the future of this company. He needs to be surrounded by people who match his energy. People who belong in the boardroom, not the laundry room." She looked pointedly at Evelyn. Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply stared back, her dark eyes entirely devoid of intimidation. The lack of reaction seemed to agitate Chloe. The mistress wanted a reaction. She wanted tears or a scene or a pathetic retreat. Evelyn gave her nothing but a cold, assessing gaze. "You know, Evelyn." Chloe leaned in closer, the smell of her heavy floral perfume overwhelming. "Sometimes in business and in life, you have to know when a merger is no longer profitable. You have to know when it's time to liquidate your assets and step aside for better management." "I couldn't agree more," Evelyn said smoothly. "Liquidating toxic assets is the cornerstone of good business." Chloe's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, uncertain if she had just been insulted. Arthur, oblivious to the undercurrents of the conversation, checked his gold Rolex. "Listen, Evelyn, the keynote speech is starting soon. I need to be up near the front with the executives," Arthur said dismissively. "Why don't you grab a plate of hors d'oeuvres and find a seat in the back? Or honestly, if you're tired, you can just call an Uber and head home. I'll be out late celebrating." He wasn't asking. He was dismissing her like a subordinate. Evelyn looked at the man she had promised to spend her life with. There was no love left in his eyes, only raw, unchecked ambition and a desperate need for validation. "I think I'll stay," Evelyn said, her voice carrying a chilling finality. "I wouldn't want to miss tomorrow's announcement." Arthur rolled his eyes. "Suit yourself. Just stay out of my way." He turned on his heel and walked toward the stage, Chloe trailing behind him like a brightly colored shadow. Before she walked away, Chloe turned back, raising her champagne glass in a mocking toast to Evelyn, mouthing the word "Cheers." Evelyn raised her glass of sparkling water in return. "Cheers," she whispered to herself. "Enjoy your last night at the top." The next morning, the sky over Seattle was a slate gray, promising rain. Inside the penthouse suite of the Meridian Global Tower, located directly across the street from the Harrington and Cole building, Evelyn stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was no longer the plain, subservient housewife from the night before. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit that hugged her frame, perfectly commanding authority. Her hair, usually tied back in a messy bun, fell in sleek, dark waves around her shoulders. On her wrist was a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than Arthur's entire house. Sitting at the heavy mahogany desk behind her was Richard Gable, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He was technically the CEO of Meridian, but in this room, he was simply Evelyn's most trusted advisor. "The board is assembled across the street," Richard said, reviewing a file on his tablet. The Harrington and Cole executive team has been waiting in the main conference room for 20 minutes. Arthur Pendleton has reportedly already taken the seat at the head of the table, assuming the CEO position is his. Evelyn chuckled a dry, humorless sound. Of course he did. He always liked to play pretend. "Are you sure you want to handle this personally, Evelyn?" Richard asked gently. "I can go over there, fire him, and present the evidence of the embezzlement to the authorities. You don't have to subject yourself to him." Evelyn turned away from the window, her eyes hard like obsidian. "No, Richard. Arthur spent 5 years making me feel small. He spent our money on his mistress. He brought her into my presence and allowed her to humiliate me. He needs to know exactly who pulled the rug out from under him, and I need to see his face when he realizes his entire life was a lease I just cancelled." Richard nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Very well. The security team at Harrington and Cole has been briefed. The forensic auditors are standing by in the lobby. Your car is ready downstairs." Evelyn walked out of the penthouse, the transformation complete. The quiet wife was dead. The sole owner and chairwoman of Meridian Global had arrived. Meanwhile, in the grand boardroom of Harrington and Cole, the atmosphere was electric with nervous energy. The massive oak table was surrounded by the top brass of the company. Arthur sat squarely at the head of the table, leaning back in the plush leather chair, exuding confidence. Chloe sat 2 seats away, playing with a silver pen, casting admiring glances at him. "I don't understand what's taking the Meridian reps so long," complained David, the chief financial officer, nervously adjusting his glasses. "They called this mandatory restructure meeting for 9 a.m. sharp. It's 9:25. "Relax, David," Arthur said smoothly, steepling his fingers. "Power plays. The new owners want to establish dominance by making us wait. It's a classic negotiation tactic. When they arrive, let me do the talking. I have a clear presentation, ready to show them how we can cut the bottom 20% of the workforce to increase their immediate quarterly returns." Chloe smiled warmly at him. "Arthur is right. We need to project strength. They didn't buy us to babysit us. They bought us for Arthur's regional strategy." Downstairs, a sleek black Maybach pulled up to the glass entrance of the Harrington and Cole building. Evelyn stepped out, flanked by 2 massive men in dark suits, her personal security detail. As she walked through the revolving doors, the receptionist who normally ignored Evelyn on the rare occasions she visited Arthur looked up and froze. Evelyn wasn't wearing her usual beige cardigans. She walked with a terrifying, predatory grace. Before the receptionist could even ask for a badge, the head of building security, a man who had just received his new orders from Meridian an hour ago, rushed forward and offered a deep, respectful nod. "Good morning, Ms. Hayes. The boardroom is cleared and ready for you on the 40th floor." "Thank you, Marcus," Evelyn said, not breaking her stride. She stepped into the private executive elevator, swiping a black keycard that only the building owner possessed. The doors slid shut, rocketing her toward the top floor. Up in the boardroom, the heavy double doors suddenly clicked. The chatter around the oak table died down instantly. Arthur sat up straight, buttoning his suit jacket, pasting on his perfectly practiced power smile. Chloe sat at attention, ready to charm whoever walked through the doors. The doors swung open. 2 men in dark suits stepped in first, taking positions on either side of the entrance. The room held its breath. Then Evelyn walked in. Arthur's smile didn't immediately fade. It froze his brain, struggling to process the visual information. He blinked, staring at the woman in the custom charcoal suit. She looked like his wife, but the aura, the clothes, the icy stare, it didn't compute. "Evelyn," Arthur blurted out, the confusion cracking his professional facade. "What in God's name are you doing here? How did you get past security? We are in the middle of a highly classified executive board meeting." Chloe scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. "Oh my God, Arthur, your wife is having a psychotic break. Evelyn, you need to leave. Security is going to drag you out of here, and you are going to ruin Arthur's promotion." Evelyn didn't say a word. She walked slowly, methodically, down the length of the room. The other executives looked back and forth between Arthur and the imposing woman, walking toward them completely bewildered. "Evelyn, I am not joking." Arthur stood up, his face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. "Get out of this room right now before I have you forcibly removed. You are embarrassing me in front of the entire board." Evelyn reached the head of the table. She looked down at Arthur, then slowly let her gaze slide over to Chloe, who was already reaching for her desk phone to call security. "Don't bother dialing, Chloe," Evelyn said, her voice echoing through the silent boardroom with absolute authority. "Security works for me." Arthur let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Works for you? Have you lost your mind? You clip coupons, Evelyn? Now get out." Evelyn ignored his outburst. She reached inside her bespoke jacket and pulled out a thick black leather folder embossed with the gold crest of Meridian Global. She tossed it onto the center of the oak table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "My name," she said, projecting her voice so every terrified executive in the room could hear her, "is Evelyn Hayes. I am the sole heiress majority shareholder and acting chairwoman of Meridian Global. And as of last Friday, I own this building, I own this company, and Arthur." She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, bringing her face inches from her husband's pale, shocked expression. "I own you." The silence that fell over the 40th floor boardroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a devastating storm. 15 highly paid executives sat frozen in their plush leather chairs, their eyes darting frantically between Arthur's pale, sweat-slicked face and the imposing, unrecognizable woman standing at the head of the table. Arthur stared at the black leather folder sitting innocently on the polished oak. His brain usually quick to spin a narrative ground to a halt. He looked at Evelyn, the sharp cut of her bespoke suit, the expensive watch, the chilling confidence in her posture. This wasn't the woman who clipped grocery coupons and asked him how his day was. This was an apex predator. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Arthur's voice cracked a desperate, reedy sound that betrayed his mounting panic. He forced a strained, hysterical laugh, looking around the table at his silent colleagues. "David, call security. My wife is clearly having a mental breakdown. She forged these documents. I strongly advise you to open the folder." "Arthur." Evelyn interrupted, her voice perfectly level, slicing through his hysteria like a scalpel. "Before you say something that will be used against you in a federal deposition." Slowly, as if the folder were wired with explosives, Arthur reached out. His fingers trembled visibly. He flipped open the heavy cover. Resting on top was a legally binding corporate structure, flowchart authenticated by a federal notary. At the bottom was Harrington and Cole. Above it, the newly acquiring parent company, Meridian Global. And sitting at the very top, listed as the sole proprietor, 100% shareholder, and chairwoman of the board, Evelyn Hayes. Beneath that was a letter of certification from the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, verifying the ownership. Arthur's breath hitched. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of grey. He looked up at Evelyn, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and incomprehension. How is this possible? You stay at home. You tend the garden. You don't have this kind of money." "My grandfather was Henry Hayes," Evelyn said simply. A collective gasp echoed around the room. Even Chloe, who had been aggressively filing her nails in an attempt to look unbothered, froze. Henry Hayes was a titan of Pacific Northwest industry, a notoriously private billionaire who had built a massive shipping and logistics empire before liquidating his physical assets into private equity a decade ago. He left me everything under a blind trust to protect my anonymity. Evelyn continued pacing slowly behind Arthur's chair, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. I wanted a normal life. I wanted a husband who loved me for me, not for a portfolio. And for a while I thought I had that. But then, Arthur, you got greedy. You got arrogant. And worst of all, you got sloppy. She turned her gaze to the two men standing guard at the boardroom doors. "Gentlemen, please let Mr. Gallagher in." The doors opened again, and a tall, severely dressed man with a thick briefcase walked in. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and offered a brief nod to Evelyn. "Board members, this is Thomas Gallagher, a senior forensic partner at KPMG," Evelyn announced, leaning against the edge of the table. "I hired KPMG 3 months ago to conduct a shadow audit of Harrington and Cole's finances, specifically focusing on the marketing and public relations budgets over the last 4 fiscal quarters." Chloe's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she jolted upright. The arrogant smirk that usually lived on her face vanished, replaced by stark, naked fear. "You have no right to look at my department's books without prior authorization," she snapped, though her voice wavered. "I own the books, Chloe. I can burn them if I want to," Evelyn retorted, her eyes locking onto the mistress. She gestured to Gallagher. "Thomas, would you please distribute the summary findings?" Gallagher opened his briefcase and began sliding thick, bound dossiers across the table to the CFO, the regional directors, and finally to Arthur and Chloe. "If you'll turn to page 4, Gallagher said, his voice a dry, monotone drone that somehow made the information even more devastating. "You will see a detailed breakdown of 32 wire transfers made from the Harrington and Cole Corporate Reserve Fund to a vendor listed as Apex Public Relations Solutions. These transfers total approximately $450,000 over a 6-month period." David, the CFO, practically shoved his glasses up his nose as he frantically scanned the page. "I remember these," he stammered, looking defensive. Arthur signed off on them personally. He said Apex was a specialized boutique agency handling the merger optics in Europe. "Apex Public Relations Solutions doesn't exist," Gallagher stated flatly. "It is a shell company registered in Delaware. The registered agent is a P.O. box in Wilmington. However, by tracing the routing numbers, KPMG discovered the destination account belongs to a joint checking account at Chase Bank. The account holders are Arthur Pendleton and Chloe Montgomery." The boardroom erupted into chaos. Executives began shouting, realizing that their golden boy, the man who was about to be named CEO, had been robbing the company blind. Wait, let me explain," Arthur yelled over the din, holding his hands up, his practiced corporate composure completely shattering. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes pleading. "Evie, listen to me. The company was underpaying me. I was bringing in millions in revenue and they were giving me pennies. We deserved that money, Evie. I was doing it for us." "You were doing it for us." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, a cold smile playing on her lips. "Is that why you used $75,000 of that money to rent a private chalet in Aspen for Chloe's birthday? Is that why you bought her a $25,000 diamond pendant from Cartier? The very pendant she is wearing right now?" Every eye in the room snapped to Chloe's chest. Instinctively, Chloe's hand flew up to cover the diamond, her cheeks burning crimson. "It was a bonus!" Chloe shrieked, looking wildly around the room. Arthur approved it as a performance bonus. "I didn't know where the money came from." "Oh, but you did it, Chloe," Evelyn said softly. "In fact, Thomas, why don't we reveal the most interesting part of the KPMG audit? The part that my husband doesn't even know about." Arthur froze his head, whipping toward Evelyn. What are you talking about? Gallagher cleared his throat, turning to page 12 of the dossier. While investigating the Delaware Shell Company, we found a secondary routing script hidden in the digital ledger. It appears that before the funds settled into the joint Chase account you shared with Mr. Pendleton, a siphon was established. A siphon? Arthur whispered, confusion battling with fear. Yes, Gallagher confirmed. Every time Arthur Pendleton authorized a transfer of, say, $50,000 to the Shell Company, only $20,000 made it to the joint account. The remaining $30,000 was automatically diverted by Ms. Montgomery to a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account registered solely in her name. Arthur's jaw dropped. He turned slowly to look at Chloe. The woman he had risked his marriage, his reputation, and his freedom for, was shrinking back in her chair, refusing to meet his eye. Over the course of 6 months, Gallagher continued mercilessly. Arthur Pendleton embezzled $450,000. But Ms. Montgomery, exploiting her administrative access to the invoicing software, initiated dozens of unauthorized dummy invoices on her own. In total, she siphoned $1.2 million into her private Cayman account. Mr. Pendleton was entirely unaware he was being robbed by his co-conspirator. You stole from me." Arthur breathed, his voice laced with absolute disbelief. The shock of his wife being a billionaire was momentarily eclipsed by the betrayal of his mistress. "I bought you everything I risked federal prison for you, and you were skimming from me." "You were an idiot, Arthur." Chloe suddenly snapped, cornered and vicious. "You were going to get caught, eventually. You're arrogant and careless. I was building a safety net because I knew you'd drag us both down." The sheer audacity of the double betrayal hung in the air. Evelyn watched them tear each other apart, feeling a strange, profound sense of closure. She hadn't just exposed a cheat, she had forced 2 parasites to turn on each other. "Enough," Evelyn commanded, her voice cutting through the bickering. Arthur turned back to her, suddenly throwing himself out of his chair. He fell to his knees beside Evelyn, grasping at the hem of her jacket. It was a pathetic, groveling display from a man who, just an hour ago, had told her she belonged in the laundry room. "Evelyn, please," Arthur begged, tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning his dignity in front of the board of directors. "I was stupid. I was out of my mind. She manipulated me, Evie. She sedated me with all this corporate ambition nonsense. I love you. We are married. We can fix this. You own the company, right? You can sweep this under the rug. I'll pay it all back. We can go to counseling." Evelyn looked down at him, her expression a mask of pure ice. She didn't pull away. She simply let him cling to her, highlighting his utter desperation. "You really don't understand who you are dealing with, do you, Arthur?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Did you think I was just going to fire you? Did you think you could embarrass me, steal from me, sleep with another woman in the bed I paid for, and simply walk away with a reprimand?" She gestured to Richard Gable, who had quietly entered the boardroom behind the KPMG auditor. Richard stepped forward, holding a sleek manila folder. "Arthur," Richard said smoothly, "I am not only the acting CEO of Meridian Global, but I am also Ms. Hayes's personal legal counsel, acting in coordination with Kirkland and Ellis. I am serving you with divorce papers, due to the fact that you committed felony fraud against an asset wholly owned by my client. The ironclad infidelity and criminal clauses in your prenup, which you signed without reading properly 5 years ago, have been triggered." "Prenup, I thought that was just a standard boilerplate document," Arthur gasped. "It was a highly sophisticated asset protection trust, Richard corrected him. As of 8 a.m. this morning, the marital home in Queen Anne Hill, which was purchased by an LLC owned by Ms. Hayes, has been locked. Your belongings have been boxed and moved to a self-storage unit in Bellevue. Furthermore, because the joint accounts were used to funnel stolen funds, the federal government has frozen all your liquid assets. You have absolutely nothing, Arthur. Not a dime. Arthur collapsed backward onto the floor, staring blankly at the ceiling. His mind simply couldn't process the magnitude of his ruin. Yesterday he was a king in waiting. Today he was a pauper facing prison. Chloe, however, was a survivor. Seeing that Arthur was a sinking ship, she quickly calculated her best odds. She stood up, smoothing down her emerald green dress, and forced a contrite, tearful look onto her face. Ms. Hayes. Evelyn, Chloe said, her voice shaking with manufactured emotion. I am so incredibly sorry. You have to believe me. Arthur forced me into this. He's my superior. He threatened to fire me and ruin my career in PR if I didn't help him set up those shell accounts. The Cayman account was just. I was holding the money to give it back to the company. I swear it. I can return it all today. Just let me resign. Let me walk out of here, and you'll never see me again. She grabbed her designer purse, taking a cautious step toward the double doors. Evelyn didn't move to block her. She just smiled. You can certainly try to leave, Chloe, but I think the gentleman in the lobby might have an issue with that. Right on cue, the boardroom doors swung open violently. 3 stern-looking men and 1 woman entered the room, the badges of the Seattle Police Department's Economic Crimes Task Force hanging from chains around their necks. They wore tactical vests over their dress shirts, their presence immediately sucking the remaining air out of the room. Arthur Pendleton, Chloe Montgomery. The lead detective, a grizzled man with a heavy mustache, called out his eyes, scanning the terrified executives until they landed on the 2 obvious targets. Chloe let out a sharp shriek, dropping her designer purse. It hit the floor, spilling expensive makeup and the keys to a leased Mercedes she could no longer afford. No, wait, I want a lawyer. You can't do this. You are both under arrest for multiple counts of corporate espionage, wire fraud, grand larceny, and embezzlement, the detective recited, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. 2 officers bypassed the table, marching straight toward Chloe. They grabbed her by the arms, spinning her around roughly and locking her wrists behind her back. Get your hands off me! Do you know how much this dress costs? Chloe screamed, her pristine PR image entirely shattered as she thrashed against the officers. I'm guessing it costs about 3 to 5 years in a federal penitentiary, ma'am, one of the officers muttered, securing the cuffs. The lead detective walked over to Arthur, who was still sitting on the floor, catatonic. The detective hauled him up by his custom Italian lapels, spinning him around and slapping the cuffs on him with a sharp click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent boardroom. Arthur didn't fight. He just looked over his shoulder at Evelyn, his eyes hollow, defeated. Evie, please. Take them out through the main bullpen, Evelyn instructed the detectives calmly. I want every single employee in this building to see exactly what happens to thieves. Yes, ma'am. The detective nodded respectfully. Evelyn's lawyers had handed the police a flawless ironclad dossier of evidence. It was the easiest collar the unit had made all year. The officers dragged Arthur and Chloe toward the doors. The entire board of directors sat in stunned, terrified silence, watching the orchestrators of the hostile takeover be marched out like common criminals. As they were pulled through the doors, Chloe weeping hysterically, and Arthur looking like a dead man walking, Evelyn turned back to the remaining executives at the oak table, the men and women who had laughed with Arthur, who had enabled his toxic culture, who had looked down on her just the night before. were now staring at her as if she were a god who had just descended from the heavens to pass judgment. David, the CFO, was physically shaking, terrified that he would be the next one in handcuffs for missing the audit discrepancies. Evelyn slowly walked to the head of the table. She pulled out the heavy leather chair, the chair Arthur had presumptuously claimed for himself just an hour ago, and sat down. She adjusted her cuffs, resting her hands casually on the polished wood. Her dark eyes swept over the terrified faces of the Harrington and Cole Executive Board. "Now," Evelyn said, a chilling, brilliant smile lighting up her face. "Let's talk about the new corporate restructuring." The first 48 hours inside the King County Correctional Facility were a brutal awakening for Arthur Pendleton. Stripped of his custom Italian suits, his gold Rolex, and his false sense of supremacy, he was reduced to an inmate number, stamped on the pocket of a scratchy, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. The jail was a cacophony of slamming metal doors, shouted obscenities, and the suffocating smell of bleach and sweat. It was a universe away from the plush leather chairs and imported lilies of the Seattle Plaza Hotel. Sitting in a cramped concrete consultation room, Arthur nervously bounced his knee, waiting for his salvation. He had used his one phone call to contact Benjamin Caldwell, a senior partner at Davis Wright Tremaine, one of the most ruthless and expensive criminal defense firms in the Pacific Northwest. Arthur had played golf with Benjamin. They were part of the same elite country club. Arthur was certain Benjamin would walk in file a writ of habeas corpus post bail and have him out in time for a steak dinner at El Gaucho. The heavy steel door buzzed and clicked open. Benjamin Caldwell walked in, but he wasn't carrying his usual thick leather briefcase, and he wasn't smiling. "Ben! Thank God!" Arthur practically leapt from his bolted-down stool, his voice echoing in the small room. "Listen, you need to get me out of here. My wife, she's lost her mind. She orchestrated this whole thing to frame me because we were having marital issues. We need to countersue Meridian Global immediately." Benjamin didn't sit down. He stood by the door, his expression entirely stoic. "Arthur, I am only here as a courtesy, because we've shared a few rounds of golf. I am not here as your legal counsel." Arthur froze. What do you mean I need a lawyer?" "You do need a lawyer, Arthur, desperately," Benjamin replied, adjusting his silk tie. "You are facing federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage charges. The FBI and the SEC have both formally adopted the case based on the forensic evidence provided by KPMG. But I cannot represent you." "Why not?" Arthur demanded, panic rising in his chest. "I'm good for the money. You know my salary." "Your salary is zero, Arthur. You were terminated with cause yesterday morning," Benjamin said coldly. "Furthermore, the United States Attorney's Office, in coordination with Kirkland and Ellis, who represent your wife's trust, has placed a federal freeze on every single bank account associated with your Social Security number. Your house in Queen Anne Hill is locked and titled to an LLC you don't control. Your retirement accounts have been seized under the suspicion that they were funded with embezzled money. You literally do not have a dollar to your name." Arthur stumbled back, hitting the edge of the metal table. His breathing became shallow and erratic. "But the firm, I can pay you when I clear my name." "You aren't going to clear your name." Benjamin sighed, looking at Arthur with a mixture of pity and disgust. "I've seen the discovery packet, Arthur. They have routing numbers, IP addresses, and signed authorizations. They have it all. And to make matters worse, Chloe Montgomery's attorney reached out to the prosecutor an hour ago. She's cutting a deal." "A deal?" Arthur whispered, the blood roaring in his ears. "She is turning state's evidence," Benjamin confirmed. "She is going to testify that you were the sole mastermind of the embezzlement ring that you used your authority as vice president to coerce her into setting up the shell companies, and that you threatened to ruin her career if she didn't comply. In exchange for her testimony, they are dropping the espionage charges against her." "That lying bitch," Arthur screamed, slamming his fists onto the table. "She stole from me. She siphoned the money to the Cayman Islands. The KPMG auditor proved it. Yes, and she is claiming you forced her to do that as a blind trust for yourself," Benjamin countered, checking his watch. "I have to go, Arthur. The court will appoint a public defender for your arraignment tomorrow. I suggest you listen to them plead guilty and hope the judge shows some mercy. Goodbye." As the steel door slammed shut behind the lawyer, Arthur collapsed onto the stool, burying his face in his hands. The walls of the concrete room seemed to be closing in on him. He had thought he was a shark. He now realized he was nothing more than chum. Meanwhile, back in the penthouse of the Meridian Global Tower, the atmosphere was a stark contrast of quiet, efficient power. Evelyn Hayes sat behind her massive mahogany desk, reviewing the morning's restructuring reports. She wore a stunning ivory blazer, her hair impeccably styled, looking every inch the titan of industry she was born to be. "We've completely cleared out the executive suite at Harrington & Cole," Richard Gable announced, stepping into the office with a fresh tablet of data. David, the CFO, was given the option to resign quietly, without a severance package, or face a secondary audit into his department's gross negligence. He took the resignation. "Good," Evelyn said, not looking up from her screen. "Who is replacing him?" "I've temporarily elevated Sarah Jenkins from senior comptroller to acting CFO," Richard replied. "She's the one who initially flagged a minor discrepancy in the marketing budget 3 months ago, but Arthur threatened to fire her if she pursued it. She's brilliant, meticulous, and incredibly loyal." Evelyn smiled, a genuine warm expression that rarely surfaced in this building. "Perfect. Give Sarah a 40% raise, full executive benefits, and tell her the permanent position is hers if the quarterly projections hold. I want a culture of integrity, Richard. Anyone who enabled Arthur's toxic frat house mentality is gone by Friday." "Understood." Richard nodded. He paused, tapping the edge of his tablet. "Evelyn, there is one more thing, regarding Chloe Montgomery." Evelyn's eyes snapped up, sharp and attentive. "What about her?" "She bailed herself out this morning, used a bondsman, put up her leased Mercedes and some jewelry as collateral. Her attorney is attempting to negotiate a plea deal with the district attorney by throwing Arthur under the bus," Richard explained. "However, the SEC just finished tracing the offshore accounts." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "And the $1.2 million she siphoned to the Cayman Islands. It's gone," Richard said, a smirk playing on his lips. "It appears Ms. Montgomery, in her infinite financial wisdom, took the stolen funds and invested them heavily into a highly volatile cryptocurrency startup 3 weeks ago. The startup was a rug pull scam. The entire exchange collapsed yesterday. Her portfolio is entirely liquidated. She has nothing to offer the government for restitution." Evelyn let out a low, musical laugh. The sheer poetry of the situation was almost unbelievable. Chloe had stolen from the man who was stealing from his wife, only to lose every single penny to an anonymous internet scammer. "Let the DA know that Meridian Global will not accept a plea deal that doesn't include significant prison time for Miss Montgomery." Evelyn instructed, her voice turning cold again. "She doesn't get to walk away just because she's broke. She made her bed. Now she can lie in it." 8 months later, the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington was packed to capacity. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, the heavy oak paneling and the towering judge's bench projecting an aura of absolute consequence. Evelyn sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution's table. She was dressed in a conservative but breathtakingly expensive navy blue suit, a subtle nod to the dress she had worn on the night of the gala. Richard Gable sat beside her, perfectly composed. Across the aisle at the defense tables, the architects of their own destruction awaited their fate. Arthur Pendleton looked entirely unrecognizable. The 8 months he had spent in county jail awaiting trial, unable to make bail, had aged him a decade. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and completely grey. He had lost at least 30 pounds, his cheekbones jutting out sharply beneath pale, sallow skin. He wore an ill-fitting grey suit provided by his public defender, a far cry from his bespoke Italian days. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, unable to look back at Evelyn. The shame was total and absolute. A few feet away at a separate table sat Chloe Montgomery. The former PR director looked equally hollowed out. Without access to her expensive skincare, high-end makeup and designer clothes, the illusion of her superiority had entirely vanished. She looked small, terrified, and utterly desperate. Her plea deal had fallen apart the moment the SEC discovered she had lost the restitution's money. Now she was facing the full wrath of the federal government. Judge Patricia Rollins, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for handing down maximum sentences for white-collar crimes, entered the courtroom. The bailiff called the room to order, and a heavy silence descended. "We are here today for the sentencing of Arthur Pendleton and Chloe Montgomery." Judge Rollins began shuffling a stack of thick files on her bench. "Mr. Pendleton, you have pled guilty to 2 counts of federal wire fraud and 1 count of embezzlement. Ms. Montgomery, a jury of your peers has found you guilty of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage." Judge Rollins looked down at Arthur, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Pendleton, the court has reviewed your statements. You claim that you were caught up in a high-pressure corporate environment, that you made a lapse in judgment. Let me be clear. Stealing $450,000 from your employer, betraying the trust of your company, and living a lavish lifestyle funded by criminal activity is not a lapse in judgment. It is a calculated, malicious series of choices." Arthur flinched with every word, his shoulders trembling. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the fact that the primary victim of your financial crimes was the parent company wholly owned by your own wife shows a level of deceit and moral bankruptcy that this court finds deeply disturbing. It is the judgment of this court that you, Arthur Pendleton, be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a term of 96 months. 8 years. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Arthur let out a choked sob, his legs giving out beneath him. His public defender had to grab his arm to keep him from collapsing completely onto the floor. 8 years. He would be in his 50s by the time he saw the outside world again, completely ruined, with a felony record that would ensure he never worked in corporate America again. Judge Rollins then turned her icy gaze to Chloe. "Miss Montgomery, you attempted to use your position to not only assist in the robbery of Harrington and Cole, but to actively steal from your co-conspirator. You then squandered over $1 million of stolen funds in an unregulated offshore market. You have shown zero remorse, only regret that you were caught." Chloe began to cry loudly, a harsh, grating sound. "Your Honor, please. I was manipulated. I'm broke." "You are going to prison, Ms. Montgomery." Judge Rollins cut her off sharply. "It is the judgment of this court that you serve 48 months in federal prison. Upon your release, your wages will be aggressively garnished until the sum of $1.2 million in restitution is paid in full to Meridian Global. Take them away." The bang of the gavel echoed like a cannon shot. U.S. Marshals moved in immediately. They hauled Arthur to his feet, slapping heavy handcuffs on his wrists. As he was turned toward the side exit, his eyes finally met Evelyn's. He looked at the woman he had underestimated, mocked and betrayed. There was a desperate apology in his eyes, a silent plea for forgiveness. Evelyn didn't sneer. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at him with profound, absolute indifference. He was no longer a factor in her life. He was just a bad investment that she had successfully liquidated. She broke eye contact, turning her attention to Richard, acting as if Arthur had already ceased to exist. Chloe was dragged out, screaming her wails, echoing down the courthouse halls long after the heavy oak doors had closed behind her. 1 year later. The grand ballroom of the Seattle Plaza Hotel was once again dripping in crystal chandeliers and the scent of expensive imported lilies. But tonight, there were no regional directors plotting hostile takeovers, and there were no arrogant vice presidents parading their mistresses. Tonight was the annual Meridian Global Philanthropy Gala. Evelyn Hayes stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Seattle skyline. She wore a breathtaking custom-designed crimson gown that commanded the attention of every person in the room. Around her neck rested a simple, elegant string of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. She didn't need flashy diamonds or $25,000 pendants to prove her worth. Her power emanated from within. "A toast," Richard Gable said, stepping up beside her, holding 2 flutes of vintage Dom Perignon. He handed her one, a proud smile on his face. "To a record-breaking fiscal year, and to the newly minted CEO of the fully integrated Meridian Coal Logistics Network." Evelyn smiled, taking the glass. Under her direct leadership, the company had thrived. She had implemented massive pay raises for the lower-level staff, revolutionized their supply chain, and completely purged the toxic corporate culture Arthur had cultivated. She had stepped out of the shadows and taken her rightful place at the head of her grandfather's empire. "To the future, Richard," Evelyn said softly, clinking her glass against his. She took a sip of the champagne and looked out over the city she now effectively helped run. She thought briefly, just for a fleeting second, of a beige coat, a patronizing smirk, and a husband who thought she belonged in the laundry room. Evelyn took another sip, turned her back on the past, and walked confidently into the center of the ballroom to greet her guests. She was no longer the poor, quiet wife. She was the queen of the board, and she owned the entire game. And that's how the quiet, unassuming wife turned the tables on the husband who thought she was nothing. Sometimes, the most powerful people in the room are the ones making the least amount of noise. The mistress thought she had secured her future, only to realize she had stolen a man who was entirely owned by the woman she mocked. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge and corporate justice, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a good karma story, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life dramas.